The knot on that rope was cinched so tight, it looked like somebody tied it for a hanging. A burlap bag lay in the summer dust at Raton Pass, kicking like an animal that couldn't scream. Elijah Mercer crouched beside it, knife in hand, and from a distance, it would have looked like he was about to do something unforgivable. He glanced up the empty trail, listened to the wind, then pressed the blade to the cord like he was deciding how fast this should end. The bag jerked again, hard enough to drag a furrow in the dirt. A young woman's breath rasped from inside, thin and panicked, as if the heat itself had hands around her throat. Eli pulled the mouth of the bag open, and her face rolled into the sunlight, bruised, dusty, and terrified. Her wrists were bound tight, her lips were split, and her eyes locked on his like he was the last mistake she'd ever make. She swallowed once, barely steady, then whispered, "Just kill me fast." Eli stumbled back, because no one says that unless they've already been taught what mercy costs. The knife in his hand suddenly felt like a confession, not a tool. If anyone came over that rise right now, they wouldn't see a rescue. They'd see a lone rancher with a blade and a bound girl half out of a sack. Out here, a rumor could outrun a horse, and a rope could settle arguments quicker than law. Eli knew that kind of math because he'd watched it happen to a man who didn't deserve it. A broken bottle at a dance, a scream nobody understood. Then a crowd that needed a villain before sundown. Eli had been younger then, and he'd learned a lesson he never forgot. If you can't explain yourself in one breath, you might not get a second. Clara May Hollis didn't look like a drifter, even under dirt and sweat. She was 21, and the fear in her eyes didn't come from coyotes. It came from people. Eli took one slow step back, then held his empty hand up, palm out, so she could see he wasn't reaching for her. He kept his voice low because loud voices turned panic into teeth. "It's all right," he said, and he hated how small it sounded. Clara's gaze flicked to his holster, then to the trail behind him, then back to the knife. She wasn't watching him like a savior. She was watching him like a judge. Eli swallowed, forced calm into his chest, and slid the knife into the dirt a few inches away from both of them. He wanted her to see distance, because distance is the first kind of safety. The bag's coarse edge scratched her cheek as she tried to pull herself back inside, like hiding could undo the world. Eli crouched again, slower this time, careful with every movement. He studied the rope, because rope tells stories when people won't. This wasn't a quick tie, and it wasn't a sloppy one. It was a working knot, the kind you use when you mean to carry something. Eli's throat tightened, because the word something didn't belong on a human being. Claire's breathing hitched, and then she turned her face away from him. "Don't drag it out," she said, and her voice came out flat like a board laid over a grave. Eli shook his head once, firm, then reached for his canteen. He held it near her mouth, not touching her, just offering. She hesitated, then drank, and the water ran down her chin in clean lines through the dust. For a blink, she looked younger than her years, and that made Eli angrier than the bruises did. He wanted names. He wanted reasons. He wanted the kind of answer that lets a man sleep, and he knew he wasn't going to get it. Eli cut one strand of cord at her wrist and eased it loose just enough to stop the bite. He didn't cut it all the way free, because fear makes people bolt, and bolting gets people shot. Clara's hands trembled, and she pressed her wrist to her chest like she could hold herself together by force. Eli kept his eyes on the trail because the mountains had a way of giving you silence right before they give you trouble. The heat sat heavy on the pass, and the flies buzzed like they were waiting their turn. Then Eli heard it. Faint at first, then steady. Hooves, not a lone traveler. Too even, too sure. Clara heard it too, and her whole body tightened. "He'll be back," she said, and she didn't have to explain who he was. Eli's jaw clenched, and he tasted dust and old regret. He looked at the road, then at the bag, then at the sky, like any of those things could offer a better option. If he left her here, she'd be gone before he found help. If he stayed, and the wrong man rode up first, Eli could end up in a noose with the same rope that bound her. That was the frontier's cruel bargain. Do the right thing, and pay for it twice. Eli moved to his horse, keeping his body between Clara and the open trail. He grabbed his bedroll, flipped it open, and laid it in the shade to keep her off the burning ground. Clara watched every motion, ready to flinch, ready to fight, ready to die. Eli spoke without looking directly at her because he didn't want her to feel cornered. "My name's Eli Mercer," he said. "I ranch near Cimarron," he added, and the words came out rough. Clara didn't answer with her name. She whispered, "Las Vegas," like she was confessing the last place she had ever been safe. Eli nodded once, because he knew that town, and he knew the long road between a town and a grave. The hooves grew louder, and a dust line lifted beyond the bend. Eli's mind raced through choices, and none of them were clean. He could hide her, but the pass had no cover that wouldn't also trap her. He could ride, but he'd be leaving her with a promise she didn't believe in. He could stand his ground and hope the men coming weren't the kind who shoot first. Hope is a thin blanket in a hard place. Eli crouched by the bag again, and his fingers found a scrap caught in the rope fibers. It was a bit of paper, smeared and creased, with a faint stamp that made his stomach drop. Rail freight. A timetable mark. The kind of ink that means numbers, not names. Eli pinched it free, and Clara's eyes followed it like she already knew what it meant. That was when Eli understood. This wasn't a crime of anger. This was business. A shadow moved on the trail, and a rider's outline sharpened against the bright summer haze. Eli stood, breath slow, shoulders squared, and he felt the weight of every bad assumption this scene could create. Clara shifted behind him, still half trapped by rope, and Eli heard her whisper a second time, softer now. "Please," she said, and it wasn't clear if she meant kill me or don't leave me. Eli stared at the rider, then looked down at the scrap of stamped paper in his hand. Somebody out there had already decided what she was worth. The only question was whether Eli Mercer was about to become her executioner in a stranger's story, or the one man stubborn enough to drag the truth into the light. "So tell me this, if you were standing in that dust with hooves closing in, would you cut her free and risk the rope meant for you, or would you ride for help and pray you weren't too late?" Eli didn't wait for the rider to come into full view. He moved first because hesitation was how men ended up remembered wrong. He stepped closer to Clara, cutting the last of the rope at her wrists, then paused with the blade hovering, watching her face. She didn't bolt. She didn't scream. She just pulled her hands in tight and nodded once, like she understood there were worse things than a man holding a knife. The hooves slowed, then stopped somewhere up the pass. Eli could feel the rider watching, measuring, deciding whether this was worth the trouble. That pause told Eli more than speed ever could. Whoever was out there wasn't lost, and he wasn't curious. He was checking his options. Eli guided Clara toward the shadow of the rocks, not hiding her completely, just enough so she wasn't the first thing a stranger saw. He set her down on the bedroll, kept his body between her and the trail, and rested one hand easy near his belt. Not on the gun, just close enough to remind himself it was there. Clara leaned forward, elbows on her knees, breathing shallow. Eyes fixed on the dust where the rider had stopped. A man's voice carried down the pass, calm and friendly in the way that usually meant neither. He asked if everything was all right. Eli answered back, steady, said he'd found a sack fallen off a wagon and was checking it for damage. It was the kind of lie that could work. If you said it like you believed it. The rider nudged his horse forward a few steps, just enough for Eli to see him clear. Middle-aged. Decent saddle. Hat pulled low. Nothing about him looked rushed or worried. That was the trouble. Men who did bad things in a hurry always made mistakes. Men who took their time usually didn't. The rider asked what was in the sack. Eli said feed. The rider smiled, a small one, and said feed didn't usually breathe. Clara stiffened behind Eli, and he felt it like a shift in the air. Eli shrugged, the way tired men do when they're done explaining themselves. He said maybe the heat was getting to him too. Said it wouldn't be the first time the sun made fools of honest work. The rider studied him, eyes dropping to Eli's boots, his hands, the way he stood. That look wasn't about curiosity. It was about counting. Then the rider said a name, not Clara's, Eli's. and that landed heavier than a threat. Eli didn't ask how the man knew it. He already guessed. Out here, names traveled faster than people, especially if they were attached to land, water, or trouble. The rider tipped his hat, said he was looking for a missing item from a wagon that came through earlier. Said it would be a shame if something valuable went missing in this heat. Clara's fingers dug into the bedroll. Eli could feel her fear climbing again. Sharp and quick, he kept his voice level. Said he hadn't seen any wagons today. The rider nodded like he believed him, which was another lie. A long moment passed. Wind, flies, the sound of leather creaking on saddle. Then the rider smiled again and said he'd keep looking farther up the trail. Said folks out here had a habit of helping each other. Then he turned his horse and rode off, slow, unbothered, leaving a line of dust that hung in the air longer than it should have. Eli waited until the sound of hooves faded for real before he let himself breathe out. He turned to Clara, and for the first time since opening the bag, he saw anger under the fear, not wild anger. Focused, the kind that survives. She asked him who that was. Eli said it was a man who knew too much for comfort and not enough for safety. She nodded, then finally said her name. Like offering it cost something. Clara May Hollis. She said it plain, without drama. Like she wanted it remembered correctly if this all went bad. Eli handed her the canteen again, and this time she drank without hesitating. He asked if she could walk. She said yes, then corrected herself and said slow. Eli smiled a little at that, because slow was something he understood. They didn't take the open trail. Eli led her along a narrow cut between rocks. A path goats knew better than men. He didn't rush her. He didn't touch her unless she asked for help stepping down. That mattered, even if neither of them said it out loud. As they moved, Clara told him pieces, not the whole thing. A wagon, a long ride, hands that tied knots too well, promises that turned into threat. She didn't say the man's name yet. She wasn't ready to give it shape. Eli listened without interrupting. He didn't offer comfort he couldn't guarantee. He told her where he was headed and why he thought going south made more sense than pushing on into Colorado. He told her about Las Vegas, New Mexico, the way it looked in the early evening, dust settling, lights coming on one by one. He didn't promise safety. He promised effort. They reached his horse, and Eli helped her up. Careful, giving her time. She sat stiff at first, then slowly eased as the motion became real again. A person on a horse is harder to dismiss than a sack in the dirt. They rode out of the pass as the sun slid lower, shadows stretching long and thin. Behind them, the mountains kept their secrets. Ahead, the road waited. Same as always. Clara asked him why he stopped, why he didn't just ride on and pretend he'd seen nothing. Eli thought about it, then said, sometimes a man meets a moment that doesn't care what he's tired of. Sometimes you either step in or you spend the rest of your life stepping around it. They rode in silence after that, the kind that isn't empty, the kind that lets thoughts settle. Eli knew this wasn't over. Men like the one they'd just seen didn't give up property without a reason. And whatever Clara had been wrapped up in wasn't finished with her yet. Night came on slow, the heat easing just enough to let breathing feel normal again. Eli pointed out a place to rest, though also a bend with water and a little cover. They'd go on at first light. That was the plan, for what it was worth. Before they settled in, Eli looked at Clara and said if she wanted to leave at dawn, he wouldn't stop her. She shook her head. Not yet. Not alone. And before we move on, if you've been with me this far, go ahead and subscribe. These old stories take time to tell, right? And I'd be glad to have you along for the whole ride. Pour yourself some tea or coffee, get comfortable, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you're listening and where you're listening from, because the road ahead for Eli and Clara is long, and the next man who comes looking won't be as polite as the last one. Dawn came in quiet, but it didn't come in kind. The heat from yesterday still lived in the rocks. Eli woke before the birds did, and he listened for hooves. He heard nothing, and that worried him more. Clara sat up on the bedroll, stiff like she'd slept with one eye open. Her hands were free now, but her wrists still carried the story. Eli handed her the canteen, and she took a careful drink. She kept looking past him, toward the pass behind them. Eli checked the ground near their camp, and he didn't like what he found. There were new prints in the dust. Not close, but close enough. One horse had a short step, and one rider had dismounted. That meant someone came near, then chose to watch. Eli didn't say it out loud. He didn't want fear to become their breakfast. He saddled his horse, tightened the cinch, and kept his motions steady. Clara stood on her own, swayed once, then set her jaw. She was weak, but she wasn't fragile. They started south, keeping to the safer line where the ground stayed firm. Eli aimed them toward Wagon Mound, then on toward Watrous. From there, Las Vegas was a real option, with real people. Clara didn't speak much at first, and Eli didn't push. Some stories come out slow because they hurt to touch. After a mile or two, Clara finally asked a question. She asked why he didn't leave her in the bag. Eli said he'd tried that kind of living once. He said it didn't make a man safer, it just made him smaller. Clara stared at the trail, like she was weighing that answer. The morning sun climbed, and the world turned sharp again. Dust lifted behind their horse, and it felt like a signal. Eli kept looking back, not like a scared man, but like a careful one. Clara noticed, and her breathing tightened. She asked if they were being followed. Eli said maybe, and he kept riding. A little later, Eli took the scrap of paper from his pocket. He held it between thumb and forefinger, like it might stain him. Clara's eyes tracked it right away, and she looked away after. Eli asked her if she'd seen a mark like that before. Clara nodded once, slow and bitter. She told him the wagon had stopped near a rail spur days earlier. Men talked numbers, like they were trading cattle. She didn't hear all the words, but she heard enough. She heard dates, and she heard a town name. She heard La Junta, spoken like a promise. Eli felt his stomach go tight. He knew La Junta by reputation and by the way freight moved. It was the kind of place a person could disappear without a scream. He didn't tell Clara all of that because she already knew it in her bones. He just nodded and kept his eyes forward. Clara started talking again, careful and clipped. She said the man who tied the knots wore a wedding band. She said his hands were clean, like he washed up after sin. She said he kept calling her by a pet name, like he owned her. That last part made Eli's mouth go dry. Eli asked if she meant family. Clara didn't answer right away, and that pause said plenty. Then she said it was her sister's husband. She said his name was Silas Crow. She said it like she hated the taste. Eli didn't react big. And that took effort, out here. Family trouble could turn deadly fast. Still, this wasn't a slap in a kitchen or a bad temper. This was rope, burlap, and rail stamps. This was a man turning kin into cargo. Clara told him she fought until her arms went numb. She told him she screamed until the gag went on. She told him she prayed until she stopped believing anyone listened. Eli kept riding, and his grip tightened on the reins. He didn't want to imagine the rest, so he didn't. They reached a stretch of cottonwoods where the shade felt like mercy. Eli guided the horse slower, letting Clara breathe. He pointed out a stand of grass and told her to watch for snakes. Clara gave him a thin look, almost amused. She said she could handle a snake if it played fair. That tiny bit of humor helped, and Eli took it. He told her most snakes were honest, at least about being snakes. Clara huffed once, and it sounded close to a laugh. It didn't last, but it mattered. The road bent, and they saw a small water stop ahead to a trough, a patch of trampled dirt, old wagon ruts that cut deep from heavy loads. Eli slowed because places like that held more than water. He looked for sign, and he found it fast. Fresh tracks. 2 horses and 1 mule. A wagon had been there since sunrise, maybe earlier. Someone had waited. And they hadn't waited long. Clara saw Eli's shoulders change, and she went quiet. She asked if it was Silas. Eli said he didn't know yet, but he knew this was wrong. He smelled smoke, faint and new. Somebody had coffee going, and that meant comfort. Comfort at a lonely trough usually meant company, and company meant questions. Eli guided the horse into the shade, short of the open trough. He slipped down first and held a hand up for Clara to stay. He didn't want her seen until he knew who was watching. Clara nodded, then froze, staring past him. Eli followed her gaze, and his blood cooled. On a fence post near the trough, a coil of rope hung neat and ready. It was the same kind of rope as the one that bound her in the bag. Eli took one slow breath, and he realized the worst truth. They weren't being followed from behind. They were being met from ahead. Eli kept Clara tucked behind the cottonwoods, low and shaded, where her pale face wouldn't flash like a signal. He stepped forward alone, slow and plain, like a man who only wanted water and quiet. But his eyes stayed on that coil of rope hanging from the fence post. It was clean and fresh, not sun-cracked, not forgotten. Somebody put it there on purpose. The trough sat in an open patch of hard dirt, ringed by old ruts and hoof prints. A little cook fire smoldered near a flat rock, and a tin cup rested by a coffee pot like the owner had just stepped away. That bothered Eli more than a stranger would. A man who feels safe enough to leave coffee unattended usually isn't alone. Eli stopped where the shade ended and the sunlight began. He didn't reach for the trough, didn't bend, didn't offer his back. He stood straight, breathed easy, and waited. Waiting was its own kind of gun. A voice came from the far side of the scrub, friendly and lazy. It said, "Morning," like it meant no harm. Eli answered morning back. Same tone, same speed. Then a man stepped into view, wiping his hands on his pants like he'd been cooking. He was younger than Eli, lean, with a face that tried to look harmless and failed. Behind him came another, heavier, with a bruised knuckle and the quiet stare of a man who likes to use it. Eli didn't move. He let them see he wasn't surprised, because surprise is what they were hunting for. The lean man asked if Eli was headed south. Eli said he was. The heavy man smiled without showing teeth and asked if Eli had seen a wagon come through. Eli shrugged. He said wagons come through every day. The lean man chuckled and stepped closer, like they were sharing a joke. Eli noticed the rope on the fence again, then noticed the lean man's hands. Calluses in the right places, knots in the fingers, rope hands. The lean man said he was just looking for a sack that fell off. He said it had grain in it, maybe flour. He said it like he was describing a nuisance, not a person. Eli kept his face still, but inside he felt the cold settle. This was them, not the boss, not Silas himself maybe, but the men who did the dirty lifting. Eli said he hadn't seen a sack. He let the words land, then added that if he had, he'd have returned it. The heavy man shifted his weight and scraped his boot in the dirt. That tiny sound made Clara tense behind the trees, and Eli could feel it without looking. The lean man's eyes slid past Eli, toward the cottonwoods. Not a full stare, just a quick measure. That was enough to make Eli's decision for him. They didn't know exactly what was behind the shade, but they suspected. And suspicion was all a bad man needed. Eli took one step toward the trough, as if to fill his canteen. The lean man relaxed a hair. Thinking Eli was turning his back, Eli didn't. He dipped only the edge of his canteen, keeping his shoulders squared to them, then straightened up again. He said it was going to be a hot day. He said it like small talk, because small talk buys time. The heavy man asked where Eli was ranching. Eli said near Cimarron. He watched their faces when he said it. The lean man's eyes sharpened for a blink. That blink was a hook in Eli's gut. They knew the name. They knew the land. Or they knew someone who did. The lean man nodded like he approved. He said a man with land ought to mind his own business. He said it soft, still smiling. Then he said something worse. He said there were folks out here who got confused, saw things that weren't theirs, and ended up regretting it. Eli kept his voice mild. He said regret is common, and so is thirst. He lifted the canteen, took a slow drink, and let that moment stretch. The heavy man stepped closer, just a little. Testing space. Eli didn't step back. He didn't step forward either. He stayed planted, like a fence post. Behind him, Clara shifted, and a twig snapped. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The lean man's head turned fast, eyes locked on the cottonwoods. His smile fell away. Eli saw the moment when talk ended and business began. The heavy man's hand went toward his belt. Not for a gun yet, for something else. A length of rope. Eli moved, not quick like a gunslinger, quick like a man breaking a horse that just spooked. He lunged forward, grabbed the lean man's wrist, and twisted hard enough to fold his elbow the wrong way. The lean man grunted, bent at the waist, and Eli shoved him into the trough. Water splashed high, drenching his shirt and stealing his breath. The heavy man came in swinging. Eli took the first hit on his shoulder, felt the sting, then drove his own forearm up under the heavy man's jaw. No fancy, just a hard shove of bone on bone. The heavy man stumbled back, and Eli used that space to kick dirt into his eyes. It wasn't noble. It was effective. The heavy man cursed, blinked fast, and reached blind for Eli. Eli grabbed the coffee pot off the rock and slammed it into the heavy man's knuckles. Metal rang, and the heavy man yelped. Shaking his hand, Eli didn't wait. He stepped in close, hooked an arm around the heavy man's neck, and dragged him down into the shade of his own body. The heavy man fought like a bull, but bulls get tired. Eli held him just long enough, then shoved him down hard onto the packed dirt. The lean man came up, coughing, face dripping, eyes wild. He reached for a gun now. Eli's hand went to his own belt, but he didn't draw. Not yet. He didn't want a shooting. A shooting would bring more men. A shooting would make Clara a prize on every tongue from here to Trinidad. Instead, Eli grabbed the coil of rope from the fence post and flung it at the lean man's face. The rope slapped him across the eyes and tangled at his neck. The lean man swore, tore at it, and in that half second, Eli drove his boot into the man's ribs, low and clean. The lean man folded, wheezing, and fell to his knees. Eli backed toward the cottonwoods and never turning fully away. He said one short sentence, aimed at the shade. He told Claire to get on the horse. Claire didn't argue. She moved fast now, pain forgotten. Fear turned into fuel. Eli heard the saddle creak, heard the horse snort, heard Claire's breath come in sharp pulls. The heavy man rolled, trying to rise. Eli stepped on the man's wrist, did just enough pressure to remind him of gravity. He looked down and spoke quiet. He said, "Tell Silas Crow the sack didn't stay lost." The heavy man spat dust and glared. He asked Eli who he thought he was. Eli said he was just a rancher who happened to stop. Then he stepped back into the trees, grabbed his horse's reins, and swung up behind Claire in one practiced motion. They rode hard, not reckless, but steady, because panic burns horses out. Eli kept them off the main line, cutting through low brush where the ground held. Claire held the saddle horn with both hands, and Eli could feel her shaking, not from weakness now. From the realization that those men hadn't wanted to talk at all. They'd wanted to take her back without noise. After a mile, Eli slowed just enough to let the horse breathe. Clara turned her head, eyes wide, and managed a whisper. She asked how many of them there were. Eli didn't answer with a number, because he didn't know. He answered with truth. He said there were enough to set a meeting ahead of them, which meant someone was planning this like a job. He reached into his pocket and felt that rail stamped scrap again. Then he felt something else he hadn't noticed before. A second piece of paper, smaller, tucked behind the first. He pulled it out, squinted at it in the moving light, and his stomach dropped. It wasn't a rail stamp this time. It was a name. Written clear as day, Elijah Mercer. Eli kept the horse moving, but his mind slowed down to a crawl. The paper in his hand felt heavier than any rifle he'd ever carried because it had his name on it. Not just Mercer, but Elijah Mercer. Written clean and confident. That meant somebody took time to learn him, and that somebody had been planning long before Eli ever saw a burlap bag. Clara twisted in the saddle, and she tried to look back without looking scared. Eli tucked the paper into his pocket, then pulled it out again, because pretending it wasn't real didn't change a thing. He held it where Clara could see, and her eyes narrowed like she wanted to tear it with her teeth. She asked where he got it, and her voice shook even as she tried to keep it steady. Eli said it was tucked behind the rail stamp, like a second label on a crate. Clara went still, and the color drained from her face. She didn't ask why his name was there, because she already knew what that kind of note was for. It was for blame. It was for a story somebody else planned to tell first. Eli rode another quarter-mile, then guided them into a shallow draw where the brush grew thicker. He slid off the horse and helped Clara down without grabbing at her, just offering his arm where she could take it or refuse it. She took it, and that tiny choice said more than any thank you would. Eli checked the ridgeline, then checked it again, because being watched once makes you expect it everywhere. Clara stood in the shade, rubbing her wrist, and she kept glancing at the open land like it might lunge at her. Eli unfolded the paper on his knee, and he studied the handwriting. It wasn't fancy, but it was sure. It looked like the hand of a man who did business and expected to be obeyed. Eli asked Clara one question, and he kept it simple. He asked if Silas ever mentioned his name. Clara swallowed, and she nodded once. She said Silas asked about ranchers near Cimarron, like he was making a list of men who could be useful. She said he asked who hauled goods, who kept to themselves, who had a reputation for trouble. Then she said something that made Eli's neck go tight. She said Silas laughed one night and told her sister that a good frame job starts with a believable villain. Eli sat back on his heel, and he stared at the dirt like it might answer him. He didn't like the word frame, because he'd seen it done. A man didn't need to be guilty out here. He just needed to be lonely at the wrong moment. And Eli had just been lonely at the worst moment of all. Clara looked at him, and her eyes finally showed something besides fear. They showed worry for him, and that worried Eli more. He didn't want her carrying his problems, not because she already had enough rope in her memories. He told her he'd get her to Las Vegas, and he said it like a promise he intended to keep. Clara asked what happens if Silas reaches town first and tells a story with Eli's name in it. Eli didn't answer fast, because the honest answer was ugly. He said people believe the first story they hear, especially if it lets them feel righteous. He said a town doesn't need proof to start whispering. It only needs a reason to talk. Clara looked away, because she understood towns too. She'd grown up around manners and church smiles, and she knew how quick a smile can turn sharp. Eli folded the paper, then tucked it deep, because he didn't want it blowing away like a warning sign. He stood, brushed dust off his pants, and forced his voice lighter. He told Clara he'd met snakes that were honest and men that weren't. He told her at least a snake gives you a rattle before it bites. Clara let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but it broke halfway. Eli took that half laugh anyway, because it meant she was still fighting. They rode on, keeping the low ground when they could, and taking the higher line only when they had to. The sun climbed, and the day turned bright and hard. Eli watched every ridge, every clump of scrub, every place a rider could hide long enough to get lucky. Clara sat straighter now, because fear had shifted into something sharper. It wasn't bravery yet, but it was focus. Around midday, they spotted a small stop ahead, a few buildings and a pen, the kind of place that sold water and oats without asking too many questions. Eli didn't want to stop, but a horse needs feed, and people need water. He told himself they'd be in and out, quick and quiet. He told himself 100 things, and none of them made the knot in his gut loosen. As they got closer, Eli noticed something that made him slow. A boy stood near the fence, thin as a rail, watching the road like it was a stage show. The boy didn't look at Clara first. He looked at Eli. Then he looked at Clara, and his eyes went wide like he'd just found the missing piece of a puzzle. Eli felt the hair rise on his arms, because that look meant talk had already arrived here. He kept his voice low and told Clara to keep her head down like she was tired and sick. Clara did it without complaint, because she understood the game now. They rode into the yard, and the air felt wrong. Men who should have been busy were standing still. A woman at the doorway stopped sweeping and held her broom like a weapon. Nobody smiled, and nobody stepped forward to greet a paying customer. Eli asked for water, and he kept his tone friendly. A man by the hitch rail didn't answer right away. He just spat dust and stared. Then he said something that made Clara flinch and made Eli's blood go cold. He said he heard a rancher was riding south with a young woman that wasn't his. Eli smiled. but it didn't reach his eyes. He realized Silas didn't need to catch them if he could turn every stop into a trap. And as Eli reached for his canteen, he saw a fresh poster nailed crooked to the post, and it had one name on it in big letters. It didn't say Clara May Hollis. It said Elijah Mercer. Eli didn't stare at the poster too long, because staring is what men do right before they get surrounded. He let his eyes flick over it once, quick as a blink. Then he turned his head like it was nothing more than a bad joke. But inside, something cold sat down in his gut. That paper was fresh, babe. The ink was bold, and the name on it was his. The yard was quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet where everyone is listening for the first man to break it. Eli kept his voice easy and asked again for water, like he was only a tired rancher with a thirsty horse. The man by the hitch rail finally moved, slow and deliberate. And he didn't bring a dipper. He brought himself closer. Just close enough to smell trouble. Clara stayed on the saddle like Eli told her. Head lowered, hair hanging forward to hide her face. But Eli could feel her breathing change, because she knew the tone of a trap now. She knew the way eyes land on you when somebody has already decided what you are. Eli reached up and rubbed his horse's neck, a calm motion for the animal and a signal for Clara to stay still. He took one step toward the trough, then stopped, because the men around the yard were shifting. 2 by the door, 1 near the feed bin, 1 behind the wagon tongue. Not a mob yet, but a circle starting to close. Eli nodded toward the poster and let a thin smile show. He said he must have gotten famous overnight. A couple of men didn't laugh. One did, but it sounded practiced, like laughter bought to cover a threat. The man by the hitch rail said he heard a story. He said a rancher named Mercer was traveling with a young woman he took by force. He said the rancher was dangerous and folks ought to do their part. He said it like he was reading from a sermon. Eli kept his hands open, palms visible like he didn't have a weapon in the world. He said stories travel fast, but they don't always travel true. He said he was taking a sick young woman to Las Vegas, New Mexico, to find her family. He said it calm, because calm is contagious if you can hold it long enough. The man squinted at Clara, trying to see her face. Clara stayed still, but Eli saw her shoulders tighten. The man took a step closer to the horse, and Eli's voice sharpened just a little. He said, "Leave her be." He didn't raise it to a shout. He didn't need to. That single edge in his tone was enough to stop the man for half a heartbeat. Half a heartbeat is all a careful man needs. Eli saw the heavy fellow near the feed bin shift his stance, like he was ready to grab a rein. Eli saw another man glance toward the door, like he expected someone inside to come out with a gun. Eli understood what Silas was doing. Silas wasn't just chasing them on the trail, he was turning every stop into a net. If you can't catch a man with speed, you catch him with whispers. Eli lifted his canteen in a small salute, like none of this bothered him. Then he did something that looked harmless. He stepped closer to the poster, as if to read it better, but his eyes weren't on the words. They were on the nails. 2 nails held it. One was loose. Loose nails mean rushed work, and rushed work means someone hung it quick and recent. Eli leaned in, and with one small motion of his thumb, he pried the loose nail just enough to make the paper sag, not tearing it down, just ruining the clean look of authority. A poster that droops looks less like law and more like gossip. It was a tiny thing, but tiny things matter when men are deciding what to believe. The man by the hitch rail took offense like Eli had spit on a badge. He stepped in, shoulders high, and reached for Eli's shirt front. Eli moved first. He caught the man's wrist, turned it outward, and guided him down toward the dust with a quiet efficiency. No show, no grand slam, just leverage and gravity, the kind of lesson ranch work teaches every day. The man grunted, half in pain and half in surprise. That surprise spread through the yard like a spark. 2 men shifted in at once, thinking they could fix this with numbers. Eli let go of the wrist and backed 1 step at keeping his body angled so he could see all of them. Clara stayed still, but Eli heard her inhale sharp. She wanted to help. He didn't want her to. Not here, not with eyes hungry for a mistake. Eli spoke louder now, enough for the porch and the doorway to hear. He said if anyone in this yard was truly concerned about a young woman's safety, they could ride with him to Las Vegas and let the sheriff sort it out. He said if anyone wanted to play hero without law, they were only helping the kind of men who hide behind papers and lies. For a moment, it worked. A couple of faces hesitated. Even the woman with the broom eased her grip, because deep down, decent people know the difference between help and a lynch mood. They just need permission to remember it. Then the thin boy by the fence cleared his throat. He pointed at Clara and said he'd seen her before. He said she was in a wagon heading north. He said the man driving it told him she was stolen. The yard stiffened again. Eli could feel the circle tighten. He looked at that boy, and he saw something that made his anger flare. The boy wasn't lying on his own. He was parroting a story someone paid him to learn. Eli took one slow step toward the boy, not threatening, just close enough to make the boy back up. Eli asked who told him that. The boy's eyes flicked to the doorway. That was all the answer Eli needed. A man came out of the building then, wiping his hands, smiling like a shopkeeper welcoming customers. But his eyes were hard, and his smile didn't belong to his face. He nodded at Eli, like they were already acquainted. Then he said something that made Clara's head snap up despite herself. He said Silas Crow had been through early this morning, and he'd left instructions. Eli felt Clara's fear flare behind him like heat off a stove. He kept his voice even, asked what kind of instructions. The man's smile widened, and he said if Eli Mercer showed up, folks were to keep him here until proper law could arrive. He said it sweet, like it was civic duty. He didn't say which law. He didn't have to. The kind that shows up for money, not truth. Eli's mind moved fast. If he fought his way out, the story would become real in their mouths. If he stayed, Clara would be taken when night fell. He glanced at his horse, then at the open yard, then at the trough. Water. Noise. A moment to break a circle. Eli reached for the canteen like he meant to fill it, and instead he kicked the trough stand hard with his boot. The trough jolted, water sloshed, and the horse spooked sideways, tossing its head. Men stepped back by instinct. In that one beat of chaos, Eli grabbed the reins, pulled the horse forward, and Clara slid back into the saddle like she was born there. Eli swung up behind her, and the horse surged. A man grabbed at the stirrup and missed. Another shouted. The woman with the broom screamed like she'd seen a devil. Eli didn't look back until they cleared the fence line, because looking back is how you get caught. They hit the trail hard, dust rising, the sun burning. Clara's hands clutched the horn, and Eli kept his voice close to her ear. He told her to breathe, slow and steady. He told her they weren't going to stop at any more friendly yards. He told her from here on out, every kindness would have to be earned. Clara nodded, then surprised him by speaking. She said Silas was always 2 steps ahead, and she hated him for it. Eli said a man who plans that far ahead usually has one thing he can't plan for. He said sooner or later, he forgets the human part. They rode until the afternoon leaned toward evening, and the land opened wide, making them feel small. Eli watched the ridge lines for riders, and he saw none. That worried him again. No pursuit meant something else. It meant Silas didn't need to chase. He only needed them to arrive where he wanted them. Eli reached into his pocket, felt the paper with his name, and then felt a rail stamped scrap again. This time he looked closer at the stamp, squinting against the light. And there, beneath the smudge, was a place name he hadn't noticed before. Trinidad. Eli's mouth went dry, because Trinidad was north, not south, which meant one terrible thing. Silas wasn't only setting traps ahead of them, he was setting them behind too. And Eli suddenly understood exactly where Silas wanted this story to end. Eli didn't like the word Trinidad in his mind, because it sounded like a gate closing. He kept riding south, but his thoughts rode north, and that tug made his shoulders feel tight. If Silas wanted them pinned to a story, then Trinidad was where the story could get dressed up as law. A town up there had deputies, papers, and enough strangers to believe whatever was posted first. Clara felt the change in him, because fear has a way of making people notice small things. She didn't ask too many questions. She only watched his hands on the reins. Eli slowed the horse just enough to think, and he guided them into a shallow cut where they could breathe without being seen from a ridge. The sun was dropping and the air was still hot, but the light was softer. Eli pulled out the rail-stamped scrap again, and he held it close to the last glow. He could make out the smudged mark now, and it wasn't a mistake. Trinidad. He looked at Clara, and he saw her trying to be brave with nothing left to hold on to but stubbornness. He told her one plain truth, because plain truth keeps people from breaking. He said the man hunting them wasn't just chasing, he was arranging. Clara's throat moved as she swallowed, and she asked if they should turn around. Eli didn't answer yes or no right away. Turning around meant riding into the teeth of the rumor, and riding south meant stepping into traps that were already waiting. He said they weren't going to Trinidad, not like hunted animals. He said they were going to pick their ground, and they were going to arrive with a plan. Clara nodded, and her eyes narrowed, like she wanted to understand the plan, even if it scared her. Eli told her the first plan was simple, and simple plans survive longer. They'd reach Las Vegas, New Mexico. Before the next full day, if the horse held, they'd find someone Eli trusted, someone who didn't get paid by gossip. Then they'd decide what to do about Trinidad and what to do about Silas Crow. Claire stared at the road ahead, and her voice went quiet. She said Silas always liked clean hands. She said he never swung a fist unless he had to, and he preferred other men to do it for him. Eli nodded once, because he'd already met the kind of men Silas hired. He thought about the rope on the fence post, and he felt his jaw tighten again. They rode until the sky turned orange, and the land cooled just a touch. Eli found a place to rest that didn't look like a place anyone would choose to rest. No fire, no open water. Just a low stand of brush, and a shallow hollow where the wind didn't carry as far. Clara didn't complain, and that made Eli respect her more than he wanted to admit. Eli chewed a dry piece of jerky, and he offered her the softer part. Clara took it, then surprised him by saying thank you. Her voice sounded rusty, like she hadn't used polite words in a long while. Eli said, "You're welcome." And he tried to smile, because sometimes a smile is just a way to keep a person human. Clara asked him something then, not about Silas, but about Eli. She asked why his name would matter to Silas at all. Eli stared at the darkening horizon, and he told her a rancher's name matters when it's tied to land and water. He told her Cimarron country had men who'd fight over a creek like it was gold. He kept his tone light at the end, because too much heavy talk can crush a tired mind. He said some men would sell their own mother for a fence line, and some would sell the fence too. Claire gave a small sound that might have been a laugh, and it might have been pain. She said Silas wasn't born cruel. He practiced it. Eli said that sounded like the kind of man who smiles while he sharpens a knife. Clara looked down at her wrist, and she said she didn't know how deep his plans went. Eli said they were about to find out, because plans always leave footprints somewhere. Night settled in, and Eli kept watch. He watched the ridges, and he watched the stars, and he listened for hooves that never came. Clara slept in short pieces, waking every so often like a person who expects hands in the dark. Eli didn't touch her, didn't even reach to pull the bedroll closer, because he knew trust has to be earned slow. Still, he stayed close enough that she could see his outline if she woke, and that was a kind of promise too. Near midnight, a sound reached them that didn't belong to coyotes or wind. A wagon wheel, far off, groaning on hard ground. Eli froze, because wagons don't travel late unless they're desperate or paid. He crawled to the edge of the hollow and peered out, using the darkness like cover. A lantern bobbed in the distance, moving steady along the low line. Not toward Las Vegas, not away from it, across their direction, like someone was cutting the road. Eli watched long enough to see a second lantern, then a third. That wasn't one traveler. That was a small string, moving with purpose. Clara stirred behind him, and Eli raised one finger for quiet. He didn't want her seeing it yet, not until he understood it. He waited until the lanterns passed, and he listened for voices. He caught only a few words, carried thin by the night. One of those words sounded like Mercer, said fast and casual, like a name on a list. Eli felt the cold in his gut deepen, because he knew what that meant. Silas wasn't just posting rumors at stops. He was placing men on roads. When the lanterns finally faded, Eli returned to Clara and sat down slow. Clara looked at him, and she didn't ask what he saw. Her eyes asked it for her. Eli told her they were leaving before dawn, and they weren't taking the main approach into Las Vegas. Clara nodded, then whispered that Silas must have friends in town. Eli said maybe, but Eli had a friend too, and that friend didn't scare easy. The sky began to pale, and Eli got them moving while the world still looked gray. They rode hard, cutting wide to avoid the obvious road. By late morning, the outlines of buildings and fences began to show, and Las Vegas sat ahead like a promise and a threat at the same time. Eli's mouth went dry, because he knew towns. Towns have eyes. Towns have mouths. And today, Las Vegas was about to meet Clara May Hollis. Then Eli saw the first rider standing outside town, not moving, just watching the road like he'd been told to count who came in. And Eli knew, before a single word was spoken, that Silas Crow had arrived first. Eli saw the rider outside Las Vegas, and he didn't like how still that man sat. A man sitting that quiet on a hot morning usually isn't waiting on a friend. He's waiting on a signal. Eli guided the horse off the main approach, not far, just enough to look like he was circling for shade. He kept Clara's head turned down again, the way you'd do with a sick passenger. He didn't want her face to become a story before she spoke a single word. The rider's eyes followed them anyway. Not curious eyes, counting eyes. Eli felt his jaw set, because counting eyes meant somebody had already given orders. Las Vegas, New Mexico sat ahead in the summer light. Dusty streets, fence lines, and the faint sound of a town waking up. A dog barked once, then gave up. A wagon creaked somewhere near a hitch rail. Smells of coffee and horse sweat drifted on the air, and for a second it almost felt normal. Then Eli remembered the poster with his name, and normal evaporated. He didn't ride straight into the center. He aimed for the quieter edge where a man could enter without announcing himself. He also aimed for one place he trusted, because trust is a rare tool, and you use it when you have it. Ida Quinn's boarding house sat on a side street, not fancy, but clean and steady. Eli had slept under her roof years back, when a drive ran long and his horse went lame. Ida had a way of looking a man over without making him feel judged. She also had a way of remembering what mattered. Eli slowed near the back, and he listened. No sudden voices, no footsteps rushing. That helped, but it didn't relax him. A trap can be quiet right up until it isn't. He slipped off the horse first, then offered Clara his forearm. She took it, stiff and careful, like taking help was a debt she wasn't sure she could pay. Eli guided her through the side gate and toward the kitchen door. He knocked once, light, then twice, the way he and Ida had always done when he passed through. The door opened a crack, and a woman's eyes looked him up and down. Ida Quinn was not tall, but she had the kind of presence that made tall men mind their tone. Her hair was pinned up neat, sleeves rolled, hands dusted with flour. She looked at Eli's face, then looked at Clara's wrist. Her expression changed without a single word. She opened the door wider, and Eli got them inside fast. The kitchen smelled like bread and soap, and it felt like a different world from the road. Clara stood there blinking, like she didn't trust warmth. Ida closed the door and slid the latch. She didn't ask for the whole story yet. She asked one question that mattered most. Is someone following you? Eli nodded once. Ida nodded back, as if she'd already assumed it. She pointed Clara toward a chair, poured water, and set it down without hovering. Then she looked at Eli again, eyes sharp now. She asked whose mess this was. Eli said a name. Quiet. Silas Crow. Clara flinched when she heard it said in this room, like it made it more real. Ida did not gasp or clutch her chest. She only exhaled through her nose, slow, like she was keeping anger on a leash. Then she said something that made Eli's stomach tighten. She said Silas had already been here. Eli didn't ask how. He asked when. Ida said early morning, just after sunup. She said he came in polite, hat in hand, talking about family trouble and a missing young woman. She said he asked questions about who had seen who on the road. She said he asked about Eli, too, as if Eli's name belonged in his mouth. Clara's hands trembled around the cup, Ida noticed, and she softened her voice a notch. She told Clara she was safe for the moment, but the moment needed to be used smart. Clara nodded, swallowing hard, eyes shiny but not spilling. Ida told Eli the town was already chewing on a story. Not everyone believed it, but enough people had heard it to make trouble. She said there were men who liked feeling useful, and men who liked feeling righteous, and Silas knew how to feed both. Eli asked if the sheriff could be trusted. Ida didn't answer fast. That was answer enough. She said the sheriff might be honest, but the deputy who ran errands wasn't. She said money talks, and in a railroad town, money shouts. Eli felt anger rise, but he kept it down. Anger makes men loud, and loud makes them easy to find. He asked Ida what she knew about Silas beyond today. Ida wiped her hands on her apron and leaned in a little. She said Silas had been sniffing around rail freight, asking about routes, asking about shipments, asking about how a person could be moved without being noticed. She said that was the kind of curiosity that never ends well. Clara looked up at that, and her face tightened. She finally said Silas was not just trying to get her back. He was trying to keep her quiet. Ida nodded, like she'd already guessed that too. Ida told Clara to stand, and she led her to a small back room. No drama, no fuss. She washed Clara's face gently with a cloth, then handed her a plain dress that didn't draw attention. She pinned Clara's hair in a simple way that changed her look just enough. It was not a disguise that belonged in a theater. It was a disguise that belonged in survival. While Clara changed, Ida turned back to Eli and spoke low. She said if Silas was confident enough to come here first, he had papers, maybe not real, but convincing. She said the town might treat this like a family dispute, and that would trap them in talk while Silas acted. Eli pulled out the paper with his name and showed it. Ida's eyes narrowed. She said that was not a warning. That was a plan. Eli asked what kind of plan. Ida said the kind where a man ends up blamed for what he tried to stop. She said the kind where a crowd gets stirred up and a rope becomes the fastest court in town. Clara returned, looking a little less like a victim and a little more like a person again. Ida handed her a cup of tea this time. Because tea slows the hands and settles the stomach, Clara took it, and her shoulders dropped a fraction. Eli said they needed authority that could not be bought in Las Vegas. Ida nodded toward the east. Not far, not impossible. She said Fort Union had men who answered to bigger rules. She said a U.S. Marshal or a territorial man might listen to evidence, not gossip. Eli felt a sliver of relief. Then it snapped when Ida added one more thing. She said Silas had left word with a man who hangs around the depot. She said that man was already watching roads, counting riders, and she said the watcher outside town was likely his. Eli looked at Clara, then looked at Ida. He asked the question that had been eating him since the poster. He asked why Silas cared so much, beyond cruelty. Ida didn't answer at first. She went to a drawer, pulled out a small ledger, and flipped to a page with smudged notes. She tapped one line with her finger. Water rights, land boundaries, names of ranches near Cimarron. Eli's name was there too. Eli's mouth went dry. Claire saw his face change, and she leaned forward. Ida spoke quiet, like she didn't want the walls to hear. She said Silas was not only selling fear, he was buying something. And he was using Clara to get it. Eli looked down at the ledger, then back up at the front window. Outside, the town kept moving like nothing was wrong, but Eli could feel the net tightening anyway. Because now he knew the worst part. Silas did not need to catch them on the road. He only needed them to take one wrong step in town. And just then, someone knocked at Ida's front door, firm and official, like they already owned the answer. The knock came again, firm and patient, like whoever stood on Ida Quinn's porch had all day and all the right to use it. Eli felt the room tighten. Clara's tea stopped halfway to her lips. Ida didn't flinch. She wiped her hands once on her apron, then looked at Eli like a foreman about to give a job. She pointed toward the back room, 2 fingers, no words. Clara stood and moved fast, quiet as a shadow. because she understood what that knock could turn into. Ida eased her into the back room and closed the door, not slamming it, just shutting it like nothing unusual was happening. Then Ida walked to the front, took a breath, and opened the door with the calm face of a woman who pays taxes and expects the world to mind its manners. A deputy stood there, not the sheriff, too young for that, too eager. Hat tipped just so, a badge catching light like it was meant to do half the talking. Behind him stood the man Eli had seen earlier outside town, the watcher, leaning against a post like he owned the street. The deputy smiled at Ida, then let his eyes drift past her shoulder into the house. Eli stayed where he was, visible on purpose. Hiding makes you look guilty. Standing your ground makes you look like you've got reasons. The deputy said he was checking on a report. He said there was talk of a rancher passing through with a young woman, and that rancher's name was Elijah Mercer. He said it slow, letting the name hang in the doorway like a rope. Eli could feel his heartbeat in his ears, and he forced himself not to move. Ida asked the deputy what kind of report. The deputy said a complaint. He didn't say from who. He didn't say what the complaint actually was. He said complaint like it was a spell that turns gossip into law. Ida asked if he had a warrant. The deputy's smile tightened. He said he didn't need one to ask questions. Ida nodded like she agreed, then said she didn't need one to refuse answers either. That earned a small shift from the watcher outside. His fingers flexed once, like he wanted to grab something. Eli stepped forward just enough to be part of the conversation, not enough to look like he was charging. He said he would answer questions, but he would answer them at the sheriff's office, in front of the sheriff, not on a porch with strangers listening. He kept his voice even, because volume turns a request into a fight. The deputy said that could be arranged. He said Eli should come with him now. Eli asked where the young woman was. The deputy said she should come too, for her protection. Eli almost smiled at that, but it would have looked wrong. Protection was a word men use when they want to get custody. Ida cut in. Gentle but firm. She said the young woman was ill, resting, and she wasn't stepping outside until a doctor saw her. The deputy looked annoyed, then tried to sound reasonable. He said he was sure the town doctor could be fetched, once everyone was at the office. Ida said no. Ida said if the deputy wanted to help, he could fetch the doctor here. That was a simple offer, and it was a trap of its own. If the deputy was honest, he would do it. If he was working for Silas, he would refuse. The deputy didn't even pretend to think. He said that wasn't his job. He said his job was to bring Eli Mercer in. Eli felt the truth sharpen. This wasn't a check. This was a pickup. Ida leaned a little closer to the deputy, lowering her voice like she was sharing an advice. She said if he dragged a rancher out of her home without the sheriff, he would be answering questions of his own by sundown. The deputy's cheeks reddened, and he glanced back at the watcher, like he wanted support. The watcher gave him a slow nod, like permission. Eli saw it all happen in one quiet moment. The deputy was not the power. The watcher was the power, and the watcher wasn't acting alone. Eli kept his hands visible, and he spoke calm. He said he would walk to the office. He said Ida could come as a witness. He said the deputy could send for the sheriff. He said all of it, like he was trying to make peace, but his mind was already making another plan, because peace was not on this porch. The deputy stepped forward into the doorway. That was a mistake. Ida shifted her weight and blocked him without touching him, just turning her body so the doorway was suddenly smaller. Eli used that beat to glance toward the back hall. The back room door was closed, but he knew Claire was breathing on the other side, listening for her life. The deputy tried to push past Ida, not hard enough to call it assault, but hard enough to call it authority. Ida didn't budge. She said one word, sharp and simple. No. The watcher moved then, coming off the post, stepping closer like he planned to help the deputy do something ugly. Eli's spine stiffened. He didn't want violence in Ida's home, but he wanted Clara safe more. Eli did something that looked like surrender. He lifted his hands a little higher, palms out, and took one small step toward the deputy. The deputy relaxed a fraction, thinking Eli was folding. That fraction was all Eli needed. Eli shifted his foot. hooked the edge of the porch step with his boot, and let his weight roll in a way that made the deputy stumble forward into the doorway. Not a punch. Not a grab. Just a stumble that broke the deputy's balance and his pride at the same time. The deputy cursed, and in that second his hand went down toward his belt. Ida snapped the door wider, and Eli stepped sideways, keeping the deputy between himself and the watcher outside. It was a rancher's move. Use what's in front of you. Use what the other man offers by mistake. Ida raised her voice, just enough for neighbors to hear. She called for the sheriff by name, loud and clear. That mattered. Towns are full of people who pretend not to notice until somebody says a name they recognize. A window across the street opened. A woman leaned out. A man paused in the road with a sack of grain. Eyes turned. The watcher outside didn't like eyes. Men doing clean business hate witnesses. The deputy froze, caught between obeying the watcher and not wanting to look corrupt in daylight. Eli held still, calm as stone, forcing the deputy to make the next move first. Claire stayed hidden, and Eli was grateful for her silence, even though he knew it cost her. Then the watcher made his move. He leaned close to the deputy's ear and said something Eli couldn't hear. But Eli saw what happened next. The deputy's face changed, not anger, fear. The deputy took one step back off the porch, eyes darting, and suddenly he wasn't thinking about Eli anymore. He was thinking about himself. He muttered something about returning with the sheriff. He grabbed the watcher's arm like he wanted to pull away from him, and the watcher jerked free, irritated. They backed off the porch, and the street noise returned in small bits, like the town exhaled without knowing why. Ida closed the door slow and latched it. She stood with her back to it for a moment, listening. Then she turned to Eli and spoke low. She said that watcher is not a deputy's friend. He's a man who collects favors, and he collects them the way a butcher collects knives. Eli nodded, and he finally let himself move toward the back room. Claire came out looking pale but steady, eyes fixed on Eli like she needed to see he was still there. Eli told her they couldn't stay in town long. Ida agreed, and she said they would not leave through the front like hunted rabbits. She said she had another way. Then Ida reached into her drawer again, pulled out that ledger, and slid it across the table to Eli. On the bottom of the page, beneath the water rights notes, was a short line written in different ink. One name, one place, one time, La Junta, and Eli realized the deputy was never the danger. The real danger was that Silas had already scheduled the sale, and the clock was already running. Ida Quinn didn't waste time with speeches. She slid the ledger back into the drawer, latched it, then went to her pantry like she was making supper. What she pulled out wasn't supper. It was a small bundle of bread, dried meat, a clean cloth, and a little tin of salve that smelled like pine. She set it all on the table, then looked at Eli like he was the only adult in the room who understood what minutes cost. Eli studied the line she'd shown him. One place, La Junta. One time, soon enough to make Eli's skin feel tight. He didn't know exactly what Silas planned there, but he knew what kind of town could swallow a person and burp up a receipt. Clara stood near the back hall, hands clasped, watching every move like she was afraid the room would disappear if she blinked. She looked better in Ida's plain dress, but the fear still sat behind her eyes. Eli didn't want to drag her into more danger. He also knew danger didn't care what he wanted. Ida spoke low. She said there was a stable boy behind her place who owed her a favor. She said there was an alley out back that led to a lane most folks didn't use. She said if a man wanted to leave Las Vegas without being seen from the main street, he could. Eli nodded. He'd always liked Ida, and right now, he liked her even more. Eli asked one question that mattered. How fast can we get word to Fort Union? Ida said fast enough if you don't mind who carries it. She said there was a telegraph office, but it was too public. She said the depot had ears, and those ears belonged to Silas. Then she said there was another way. A retired soldier lived on the east edge, a man who still had friends who wore federal authority. Ida called him Mr. Pruitt. Eli didn't know the man, but he trusted Ida's judgment better than the town's. Ida sent the stable boy running with a short note. No names, only a request to meet at a certain fence line outside town. The boy left through the back like a mouse, quick and quiet. Eli watched him go, then looked at Clara. He told her they were leaving too, but not to La Junta yet. First, they needed something stronger than courage. They needed a witness with weight. Clara's lips parted like she wanted to argue, then she closed them again. She wasn't used to being included in decisions. Being included frightened her almost as much as being chased. Ida put the cloth and salve in Clara's hands. She told her to clean her wrists and keep them covered, not because shame belonged to her, but because bruises draw questions, and questions draw crowds. Clara nodded and did it, careful and quiet. Eli saw her hands steady a little once she had a task. Sometimes a task is a lifeline. They left Ida's house through the back, stepped into the alley, then into the lane. It smelled like dust and horses and warm wood, and it felt like the part of town that didn't care about gossip. Eli led their horse slow, because fast makes heads turn. Clara kept her eyes down, playing the role of a tired relative, and she did it well enough that Eli felt a stab of sadness. A young woman shouldn't have to learn how to vanish. They reached the fence line outside town where Ida said to wait. A cottonwood stood there, leaning like it had given up fighting the wind. Eli put Clara in the shade and kept his own body in the sun, because a man in the sun is easier to see, and Eli wanted to spot trouble before it spotted them. Minutes passed. Then hoofbeats came, soft and steady, and a rider approached at a calm pace. Older man, gray at the temples, straight back like he was trained to carry weight. He didn't look like a deputy. He looked like someone who'd been a soldier, then had enough of orders. The rider stopped and watched Eli first, not Clara. Then his eyes slid to Clara's bandaged wrist, and his mouth tightened. He introduced himself as Harlan Pruitt. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Eli told him only what he had to. He said he found the girl bound in a sack. He said men tried to take her back. He said a deputy came to Ida's door without a warrant. He said his name was being passed around on posters like bait. Pruitt listened, then asked one question that made Eli respect him. He asked who benefit, not who is angry and not who is hurt. Who benefits? Eli glanced at Clara. Clara swallowed, then finally said it. She said Silas Crow. She said he was her sister's husband. She said he was taking her to be sold. She didn't cry when she said it. She sounded tired of being polite about evil. Pruitt's eyes sharpened. He asked where Silas planned to take her. Clara looked at Eli, then told Pruitt what she'd overheard. La Junta. She said it like she hated the sound. Pruitt nodded once, and Eli felt something shift. A plan needed shape, and this man could give it shape. Pruitt said Fort Union would take an interest if human cargo was moving along rails. He said he still had a way to get a message into the right hands. Then he said something that made Eli's stomach drop. He said word from Fort Union might not arrive in time to stop an exchange. Eli asked what they do then. Pruitt said you do what men have always done when law is far. You gather proof, and you pick ground. He said if you walk into a trap empty-handed, you become the story. If you walk in with evidence, you change what people can safely believe. Eli thought about the rail stamp, the note with his name, the ledger line Ida showed him. Pieces, not enough yet. He needed something that would hold up under daylight. Pruitt told him there was one place in Las Vegas where talk always turned into paper. The depot office, freight records, logs, names, times. If Silas had been moving people like cargo, a trace would exist somewhere, even if it was hidden under another name. Eli didn't like going near the depot, because the watcher and the deputy had already sniffed around Ida's house, but he liked the idea of being framed even less. Claire stood there, hands wrapped in cloth, and Eli saw her courage wavering. Not because she was weak, because she was human. Eli made a promise in his own plain way. He told Clara he wasn't letting her go back into a sack, not in Las Vegas, not in La Junta, not anywhere. Clara looked at him, and for the first time her eyes showed something that wasn't fear. It was a thin spark of belief. Pruitt said he would send word to Fort Union today. He said Eli should stay out of sight until nightfall, then move with care. He said if Eli went to the depot, he should go like a man with a purpose, not a man sneaking, because sneaking is what guilty men do. They agreed on a time. They agreed on a place to meet again. Pruitt rode off, steady and unhurried, like danger wasn't new to him. Eli led Clara back toward town, staying along the outer lanes, keeping his hat low. The sun was starting to sink, and Las Vegas looked almost peaceful again. Almost. Then Eli saw a fresh smear of paste on a post near the edge of town, and a new sheet of paper being pressed flat by a man's palm. Eli didn't need to read the whole thing. He saw one bold word in the middle, printed big for anyone passing by. Wanted. And underneath it, the name wasn't Clara May Hollis. It was still Elijah Mercer. Eli watched the man smooth that fresh poster onto the post, and he felt something sour rise behind his ribs. Wanted. His name. Big letters meant for men who liked feeling useful. And big letters meant Silas was in a hurry, because only a hurried liar prints large. Eli didn't tear it down. Not yet. A man ripping posters off bets is a man advertising guilt. Instead, he guided Clara one street over, kept to the shadow line, and moved like he belonged. He told himself to breathe slow, because panic makes your boots loud. Clara stayed close, eyes down, hands wrapped, looking like a tired niece being walked home. But Eli could feel her fear through the air between them. He kept his body angled so anyone watching would see a rancher leading a sick young woman, nothing more. At the corner, Ida's stable boy appeared like a ghost, panting, eyes wide. He didn't speak, just handed Eli a folded note and vanished again. The note was from Ida, short and sharp. She said the depot clerk was still on duty, and the watcher was moving between the saloon and the platform. She said if Eli was going to touch those freight records, it had to be now, before night turned the depot into a campfire for every liar in town. Eli read it once, then crumpled it in his palm and tucked the scraps in his pocket. Clara looked up at him, and he could see the question in her eyes. Eli gave her the answer without saying too much. He said they needed paper that told the truth, because talk was being rented out. They cut through a back lane and came out near the depot where wagons loaded, not where gentlemen bought tickets. The air smelled of coal smoke and creosote, hot wood and old sweat. Men lifted crates, horses snorted, and somebody cursed about a bent nail. It was loud enough to hide them, which was a blessing and a threat. Eli stopped Clara behind a stack of empty crates and told her to stay put. He didn't want her near the office window where a curious man could recognize fear. Clara nodded, but her eyes stayed on him. She did not want to be left alone, not even for a minute. Eli understood. He leaned in close and spoke low. He told her he would be back before she had time to finish one slow breath. Eli walked into the freight office like he had a right to. The clerk behind the counter was thin, ink-stained, with eyes that had seen too many angry men and too many unpaid bills. Eli asked for a record check, nothing dramatic. He said he was looking for a shipment marked as grain or feed that came through under a certain route. He slid a coin forward, not like a bribe, more like oil for the gears. The clerk's eyes flicked to the coin, then to Eli's face. Eli could see the clerk deciding whether Eli was a customer or trouble. Eli helped him decide. Eli spoke plain, said he was not looking to start a fight. He was looking to settle one. The clerk sighed and pulled out a ledger. He ran a finger down the page, slow, then faster. Then he stopped. His eyebrows lifted a fraction, and that fraction made Eli's stomach tighten. The clerk asked Eli to repeat the route name. Eli did. The clerk licked his finger, turned a page, and glanced toward the door. Like he feared someone might be listening. Eli already knew someone was outside. A boot scraped on the platform boards. Eli didn't turn his head. Turning your head is how you show what you're afraid of. The clerk tapped a line in the ledger. Not loud, just enough. He said a wagon listed as feed came through, but it wasn't feed. It was marked special handling. No details, just a note about keeping it out of sight. Eli felt his pulse jump. Special handling could mean anything, but in a town full of lies, even a vague truth matters. Eli asked the clerk who signed for it. The clerk hesitated. then said a name that hit like a slap. Silas Crow. Eli held his face still, because triumph is dangerous. He asked where it was headed. The clerk shook his head, then pointed to another column. Destination. La Junta. Date. Soon. Eli's hands clenched under the counter. So it was real. Not just rumor. Not just Clara's memory and Eli's fear. Paper said Silas was moving something, and paper said where. Eli asked for a copy. The clerk almost laughed, then stopped, because Eli's eyes told him this was not a joke. The clerk said copies cost more than coins. They cost trouble. Eli slid another coin forward and said he would carry the trouble, not the clerk. The clerk stared, then took a blank sheet and began to write a simple note. Careful, neat, with the date and the line number. The kind of detail that holds up when men start lying. That was when the office door swung wider, and the watcher stepped in. Same man from outside town, same counting eyes. He smiled like he was greeting an old friend, but his eyes were cold. He said Eli Mercer, loud enough for the men outside to hear through the window. The clerk froze. Eli stayed calm, but he could feel the room shrink. The watcher glanced at the ledger, then back at Eli. He asked what Eli was shopping for. Eli said oats. The watcher smiled wider, like he enjoyed the lie. He stepped closer, and Eli saw the handle of a pistol at his hip and the easy way his hand hovered near it. The watcher wasn't a deputy, but he carried himself like a man who had already paid for permission. He told Eli the town was looking for him. He told Eli it would go easier if Eli came quietly. Eli looked past him through the window and saw two more men drifting closer to the freight office, pretending to examine crates. A circle again, always a circle. Eli's mind went straight to Clara behind the crate. If this turned into a grab, she would be found. If she was found, she would be taken. And if she was taken, the ledger would become ash or worse. It would be used against Eli as proof he was the thief. Eli made a decision that felt like swallowing a nail. He reached out, took the clerk's half-written note, and folded it quick. Then he did something that looked careless. He dropped a coin on the floor. It rang and rolled, drawing eyes down for the smallest moment. Eli moved in that moment. He shoved the ledger toward the clerk, forcing it closed, then stepped sideways and drove his shoulder into the watcher's chest, not hard enough to crush, hard enough to stagger. The watcher hit the counter, cursed, and reached for his gun. Eli didn't wait for a gun. He grabbed the ink bottle and flung it low, splattering dark across the floorboards. Men slipped by instinct, boots skidding. The watcher hesitated, because falling in front of witnesses is its own humiliation. Eli used that hesitation to get out the side door. Moving fast now, because the quiet part was over. He rounded the crates, grabbed Clara's hand for the first time without asking, and pulled her into motion. Clara didn't fight it. She ran. They cut behind the stacked freight, ducked under a wagon tongue, and burst into the narrow lane Ida had described. Behind them, voices rose, boots pounded, and somebody shouted Eli's name like it was a prize. Eli kept running until his lungs burned. He didn't stop until they reached the back alley by Ida's place. He slammed the gate shut and leaned in close to Clara. He pressed the folded note into her palm, because if he was grabbed, the truth had to survive him. Clara's eyes locked on his, wide and shaking, and she asked one small question with her face. Are we safe? Eli looked over her shoulder, and his stomach dropped again, because at the far end of the alley, a silhouette stepped into the light, and the voice that followed was calm, familiar, and too close. It said, Eli Mercer. I've been looking for you. That voice in the alley was calm, familiar, and close enough to make the hair rise on Eli's arms. Eli didn't turn fast. Fast turns look like fear, and fear's what predators feed on. He turned slow, shoulders squared, keeping Clara behind him, and he let the shadowed figure step into the last strip of light. It wasn't the deputy. It wasn't the watcher. It was Silas Crow. Silas looked clean. Not clean like a man who worked, clean like a man who never got his hands dirty because he paid others to do it. His hat sat straight, his boots were polished, and his smile came easy. He held his hands open like he was offering peace, and that was the scariest part. Men offering peace when they've earned war are never offering peace. Eli felt Clara tremble behind him, and he kept his voice steady. Silas spoke first, soft and friendly, like this was a family misunderstanding in a parlor. He said he only wanted to take Clara home. He said Eli had gotten mixed up in something he didn't understand. He said the town was already talking, and that talking could get a man hurt. Eli didn't answer with anger. He answered with the truth he'd earned the hard way. He said Clara came out of a bag with rope marks on her wrists. He said people don't put family in sacks. Silas smiled wider, like Eli had told a funny story at the wrong table. Then Silas said the line Eli feared most. He said a man can make anything look ugly if he tells it first. Clara's breath hitched. Eli felt her hand clutch the folded note he had pressed into her palm. That note mattered. It was proof that moved like a heartbeat, and Silas knew proof mattered too. Silas's eyes flicked down for half a second. Not to Clara's face, but to her hands. He was looking for paper. Eli made the choice that ranchers make when a storm hits and you have seconds, not speeches. He stepped sideways, blocking Silas's line to Clara, and he raised his chin. He said the law would hear this in the open, not in an alley. Silas shrugged, still smiling, like law was a coat you wear when it suits you. Then, from the far end of the lane, boots scraped again. The watcher appeared, and another man with him. Eli realized Silas didn't come alone, and he didn't come to talk. Ida's back door opened behind them, quick and quiet. Ida Quinn stepped out with a look that could freeze boiling water. She did not carry a gun. She carried a lantern and held high enough for neighbors to see. And neighbors did see. That was Ida's weapon. Light. Witness. The kind of thing crooked men hate. Silas's smile faltered a fraction. He didn't like being seen. He took a step back, then lifted his hands again. Playing the gentleman. He said he did not want trouble. Ida said nothing. She only held the lantern higher. Silas looked down the lane, measuring how many windows were awake, how many eyes were watching. He made a choice that told Eli everything. Silas retreated, slow and smooth, like a man who planned to win later. Not now. Eli didn't chase you. You don't chase a man who wants you to look violent. Instead, Eli turned to Clara and guided her inside Ida's kitchen. He shut the door, latched it, and the three of them stood there in the warm smell of bread and soap, breathing like they had just outrun a flood. Clara opened her palm and showed the folded note. Ink lines, a date, a route, Silas Crow's name tied to freight and Lejeune to paper that did not care about charm. Ida nodded once, like she'd been waiting for something solid to hit the table. Eli looked at Clara and saw her shoulders sink, not from defeat, but from the strange relief of being believed. Now let me step out of the dust for a moment and talk to you like I'm sitting across from you at the kitchen table. I've told a lot of frontier stories, and I'll tell you something honest. The part that stays with me is not the fist, not the chasing, not even the guns. It's that sentence, Clara whispered when Eli pulled the bag open. Just kill me fast. That line is what happens when someone has been pushed so far they start mistaking an ending for mercy. And if you've ever had a day where you thought you couldn't take one more thing, you know how dangerous that kind of thinking can be. Here's what I keep coming back to. Eli could have ridden on. He could have told himself it wasn't his business. He could have stayed safe and stayed small. But he stopped. And that one stop changed everything. It didn't make his life easier. It made his life meaningful. That's a lesson worth carrying into our own days. Even if we'll never see Raton Pass or smell coal smoke at a depot, doing the right thing rarely feels like a clean win in the moment. Sometimes it looks suspicious, huh? Sometimes it costs you sleep. Sometimes it puts your name on a poster you didn't earn, but the right thing has a strange power. It gives you a spine you can lean on later. Another lesson is about stories. Silas tried to win by telling the first story loudest. He tried to turn truth into gossip and gossip into law. How many times do we see that now? A rumor spreads, a label sticks, and a good person spends months undoing one bad sentence. So here's a question for you. In your own life, have you ever let someone else write the story about you? Have you ever stayed quiet while a lie grew legs? And if you have, what would it look like to take your story back? Not with shouting, but with calm proof and steady steps. Eli's lesson's also about choosing your ground. He did not fight on Silas's terms. He did not swing first in front of witnesses who wanted a villain. He looked for light, for paper, for people like Ida and Pruitt who still cared about truth. That matters for us too. When you face conflict, don't fight where the other person's strongest. Don't argue in a place designed to make you look foolish. Pick your ground. Pick your time. Bring your receipts, your patience, and your character. And then there's Clara. She didn't become strong because she never felt fear. She became strong because she kept moving anyway. She drank the water. She stood when her knees wanted to fold. She trusted 1 inch at a time. If you're listening right now and you feel like you've been carrying something heavy for too long, hear me, you don't have to leap to the finish. You only have to take one honest step today, then another tomorrow. So I'll leave you with a few questions, the kind worth sitting with. Who in your life needs you to stop and pay attention, even when it's inconvenient? What lie are you still letting live rent-free in your head? And what proof of your own goodness have you forgotten to look at lately? If this story gave you something to hold on to, do me a favor, hit like. It helps this channel reach the kind of folks who still value hard lessons told plain. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and stay with me, and I'll keep bringing you these old trails and the people who walked them. Because some lessons only come through dust and distance. Eli Mercer stepped between Clara and Silas, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he refused to be a bystander. And in the next part of this story, the paper in Clara's hand is going to force Silas to show his real face in the one place he cannot charm his way out of, right in front of the people he paid to believe him.